Good morning and welcome to this week's Jump Recruitment discussion. In recruitment, they say that the only constant is change, and if we don't move with the times, then change will be the thing that actually controls you. This year, we've been talking a lot about the market, how tech's changing, how buying habits are changing, how candidates and clients are changing. However, this year, one of the biggest changes that's happening across the recruitment marketplace in the changes of some of the laws that govern recruitment agencies and their supply chain, and what could have a dramatic impact on all recruitment agencies across the business. Now, usually I sort of start off with some stats, and it was quite hard to find some stats. So I've actually dug really hard to find some stats on what's actually happening in the UK. So in the last 10 years, there have been 456,210 tribunal cases brought against the Working Time Directive law. That's the number one tribunal case across the UK. Number two, however, which is always interesting for recruitment agencies, was unauthorised deduction from wages, which stood at 293,418. Third was unfair dismissal at 446,000, and down at six, and we'll cover six because it might be an interesting one, was the Sex Discrimination Act at 77,000. The HMRC, as we know, is cracking down massively on umbrellas and umbrella companies that are used by contractors. They have at this moment over 10,000 tribunal cases pending. The number of individual incidents increased sevenfold in a year from 1,200 documented at the end of June 2021 to over 10,000 at the end of June 2022. So it says the HMRC are really looking at the umbrella cases and what's going on. And that list sort of goes on. So today I'm lucky to have probably one of the busiest people in the recruitment sector, Simon Block, who's an employee partner for JMW, solicitors in Manchester. He's over 20 years employment law experience. Today he's going to give some really valuable advice on how to work with the law and what laws may affect the marketplace. We're also joined by Paul and Heather. I've already told Paul that he's live on screen all the time. So if you catch him typing, please feel free to note that. So Simon, thanks for joining us today. So I'm going to kick off with a nice, easy question, which I normally kick off with. Normally I go to Heather because she loves the first question, but today, Heather, we're not going to go to you. Okay. So nice, easy entry question then, Simon. The government have recently announced a consultation on the regulation of umbrella companies. How or can you outline the proposed changes and how they will affect the recruitment industry?
Yes, this is a good question, and one that is going to shape how how it looks for umbrellas and the contracting world going forward. And this isn't something that is just come about overnight. This is something that has been in the pipeline for quite a number of years now. If you go back to umbrellas and I would say unraveling some of the mystique about the umbrella world, because there is a little bit of mystique about it in terms of people trying to understand it. You may recall the Taylor report to Theresa May's government. That just shows how long ago it was, how many prime ministers that we've had since Theresa May.
One every 3 months, I think, at this current rate.
But the use of umbrellas is very important in the contracting world because many are not able to go through the entire rigmarole and the process of boarding onto somebody's payroll. So umbrellas play a very important role in that process. And there was talk in the Taylor report about the regulation of umbrellas in terms of coming under the Employment Agency Standards Inspectorate and whether they were going to be protected under the defined within the conduct regulations. But where we find ourselves landing at the current time is on the 6th of June, the government's announced its intention to publish a consultation on the policy options aimed at regulating umbrella companies and tackle non-compliance within the umbrella company market. And it comes in response to the government's call for evidence that they sought back in November 2021, which closed in February 2022. And what the government has said is that they are putting forward the following points as part of the consultation. Number one, increase regulation on the way in which umbrella companies provide employment rights with a particular focus on pay and holiday pay. That's number one. Clear definition of the role that umbrellas play in the labour market and 3, mandatory due diligence in order to tackle tax non-compliance. Now, I'm not going to look at the tax non-compliance, but I can tell you now, the tax non-compliance is still a massive, massive point in all of this. But it's not really something that I'm going to cover. I'm not a tax expert by any means. But you go and look on guidance that is published by the government about umbrella companies and the warning signs to be aware of, and many of the points often come up with tax compliance, tax avoidance, naming and shaming umbrellas who come up with too good to be true schemes that you really, really need to stay clear of. So what the government's done is they've identified the regulation of umbrella companies as a 2-step process. They're going to use primary legislation to define what an umbrella company is. May surprise you all, but there is actually no definition of what an umbrella company actually is. All an umbrella company is, or a brolly, if you want to, I've heard it referred to as that many times, is a limited company. That's all it is. So what the government has suggested in the first instance, it's got 2 ways it's going to try and come up with a definition for umbrella companies. The first option is they'll define an umbrella company and simplify the method of engagements that are used within the recruitment sector. And it gives the definition as follows, and I'll just read it out so you just get a flavour. It's quite short. A person or business, whatever their legal form, who may be engaged as a corporate work seeker by the employment business to employ or engage an individual who is looking for work, and that the umbrella company would employ or engage that individual with a view to them being supplied to carry out work for a hirer in line with the arrangements between an employment business and an hirer. So it's playing on some of the language that we might already be familiar with in terms of the conduct regulations, and there's already definitions out there under the agency workers regulations, which I expect that they may try and look at. And once we've got it, if they go with that option, then the government would look to regulate the methods of engagement, simplifying the payment arrangements within the recruitment sector, and introduce specific models that are permitted within the recruitment sector. So that's one method that they're looking at. Number 2, defining what an umbrella company is by applying 3 tests. And this is a 3-step test that you're going to need to satisfy in order to be classified as an umbrella company. So what the tests are as follows. In addition to the umbrella company, there should be 2 separate businesses, an employment business and a client involved supplying the worker. The umbrella company must have a direct contractual relationship with the worker who is supplied to the end client, and that requires the umbrella company to pay the worker at an agreed rate. But the umbrella company is in no way responsible for finding any work. That is the entire responsibility of the employment business. And the third piece of the test, the umbrella company will usually receive some form of fee for that service that they provide, which is to be deducted from the worker's gross pay, and therefore directly or indirectly makes up part of the total amount of the gross that is received from the employment business. And that will link in with the key information document. And what the government said, this is the final point, the main objectives for promoting the changes as part of the consultation are to improve the conditions for workers by reducing the number of non-compliant operators in the market, increase compliance and enable umbrella businesses to operate on an absolute level playing field. We've definitely seen lots of that in the past where umbrellas, some umbrellas are able to promote their services because they're not playing the same field, and reduce the loss that arises from instances of non-compliance by umbrella companies. And no doubt that's coming from the tax perspective when the government miss out on loads of tax.
So looking at that, there's lots of things happening. You've listed 3 things there that clients should be sort of looking at. So to prevent the sort of agency owner being the wally under the brolly, let's call them.
The wally under the brolly. I like
very
that.
good, Howard.
Like that.
Taken all week to work on that line.
All week, indeed. Okay, how do we ensure that our umbrella companies and the candidates are actually compliant?
Say that again, sorry, Howard, that last bit.
How would an agency only ensure that the umbrella company that they're using and the candidates are actually compliant? Because obviously sometimes this is quite sort of new and disguised.
It can be the bits of the Wild West out there in terms of making sure that you enter into a relationship with an umbrella that is I would consider to be compliant and upholds the standards of how employment law and the tax rules operate. I think the best advice that I can offer in terms of how you go about undertaking due diligence is, if you've got a compliance arm to your business, they should be going through the due diligence process. I would say using one of the approved, professionally recognized umbrella companies. I work with the FCSA. I assess for the FCSA. I will promote the FCSA. They do a fantastic job in upholding compliance standards, but there are others out there. There's Professional Passport. There are other tools that look at pay checking, pay slip checking services. There is SafeRec. So there are various others out there who are able to provide services. But you're going to want to make sure that the deal that is being offered to the contractor is not just looking too good to be true, that there are not loads of side documents. You'll often hear about things where people end an employment contract, but lip service is paid to that employment contract with an umbrella. And there's a side agreement that says, but you also get this if you enter into the advanced option and you want to have more take-home pay with things like dividends that are payable if you're a director of this company and things like that. These are all things that you need to be on the lookout for. And the thing is that at the end of the day, whilst it may be the individual who is actually the contractor who is liable if they don't pay their tax properly at the end of the day, the damage that it is going to do to your business if you enter into relationships with umbrella companies who are unscrupulous and sail that close to the wind is going to do irreparable damage to your brand and your business. So I think you can't be too careful who you enter into a relationship with. But I think once you know that somebody has been through a vigorously audited process, and I can tell you now because I audit the employment law processes for the FCSA, I'm one of the providers to that. I know the amount of depth the questioning goes into in terms of making sure that the employment law compliance is there. And I know that the tax partners who work on those audits do the same.
I mean, sorry, go on,
Go on. I was going to add to that. I think you're right. You know, looking at the compliance, some of the compliance yourself, using somebody like the FCSA or Professional Passport as an additional level, all of those is really good. The other thing I would do is also educate all the parties involved. So, yes, you know, I've seen red flags where candidates are absolutely insistent they want to use a company that, you know, the organisation is not comfortable doing. Normally, that's because they're going to get more take-home pay, and so you know something dodgy is going on. So I think some education around what good looks like, what candidates should look out for, how they make good choices, what, you know, especially on the tax avoidance piece, the consequences of tax avoidance, why we work with compliant umbrellas, because there's some real education, I think, required around what good looks like, because not all candidates know how to spot it.
Like, you can look at a pay slip. Just talking about that, and I know this is probably a bit too much detail for now, but I'll just give you a few key nuggets that you can just look at. By looking at a payslip, I cannot tell you how much you can glean. Sometimes a payslip is something that you get and you think, great, the money's in the bank, I'll put the payslip in the drawer and I'm never going to look at it ever again until I actually really need to. But looking at things like national insurance that is paid on that payslip, it's an employment cost, holiday pay, how that's itemized on the payslip, making sure that the people who are paying you is actually the people who you've entered into a contract with. You wouldn't find it acceptable that somebody is paying you who you have absolutely no idea who they are. These are all basic points that through basic levels of compliance that somebody should start to look at, because you can't just really say anymore, well, they're going through an umbrella company, it's not really my problem.
Yeah,
because
that's not the case.
ultimately it's
Yeah.
just not going to wash, and there is going to come a time whereby a finger is pointed, and your conduct could be questioned as an agency.
Just another point worth making here, and I think very wise words from both of you guys, is the fact that companies, employers, owners need to take control of this process. I mean, not many years ago, in fact, I'd been hearing stories of umbrellas, people working for umbrella companies swarming around consultants, offering them incentives, shall we put that in inverted commas, to push contractors in their direction.
Brown paper bags I heard of.
Well, I wasn't going to say that, but since you mention it, absolutely. And I think
years ago, I'm talking a long time ago.
It was a while ago, but I'm not aware of that practice going on today, to be fair.
No,
but
I'm not.
It may be still the case. All I'm saying here, I think, is that make sure you control centrally which umbrella businesses you decide to go with, rather than allow your consultants to be making those choices, because they may not be making wise choices. And I mean, the point that's being made here is ultimately the finger may be pointed back at the business as an entity, and so you need to take complete control of the process. And I mean, I think Simon's point about seeking professional advice is very, very sound. Speak to your lawyer, speak to your accountants, make sure that you're getting the correct advice before you plunge in, because there could be some unpleasant repercussions down the line.
But to move on, because we've got lots of questions to ask, and there are lots of questions to ask, so I'm going to go sort of straight into another question, which is one that I think is a little bit of a blind question for a lot of recruitment agency owners, especially now with a new drive for every recruiter needs to be a marketeer and putting things on LinkedIn, Facebook, etc., etc. So I understand there's been proposed amendments to the Equality Act and to address the harassment in the workplace, which will extend employers' duties to protect employees against sexual harassment and reintroduce the protection from third-party harassment. Now, that's a really big thing. Will this cover online harassment, especially social media? Because obviously I see lots of recruiters complaining about that type of harassment daily.
So just to give a bit of background to that, the Worker Protection Amendment of Equality Act bill was introduced via a private members bill back in June 22, and it's going to try and amend the Equality Act to impose a duty on employers to take all reasonable steps to prevent harassment in the workplace. That's where it all comes from. The bill also intends to reintroduce a protection against harassment of employees by third parties, and as a result of the provision, employers could therefore be liable where their employees have been harassed by a third party if they've not taken reasonable steps to prevent it. So there's currently defences that are available to discrimination if you can show that you've taken reasonable steps. So, for example, often people see this by way of introducing like an equal opportunities policy and implementing training and regular refreshing going on. But with the fact that this can now be from a third party, it's going to make it even more important to make sure that those reasonable steps have been complied with if you're going to avoid a complaint. In terms of making sure that you provide the relevant protections in place, I think the things that you're going to want to look at is having implemented an equal opportunities or diversity, equality and inclusion policy, anti-harassment, anti-bullying, and regularly reviewing those policies, making all employees aware of the policies and the implications, and providing the adequate level of training on those opportunities, on equal opportunities and discrimination, because tribunals are going to have to consider the content and the nature of any training providers, and managers and supervisors will also need additional training to make sure that they're handling equal opportunities and harassment issues correctly. One of the biggest things that I see when I'm dealing with equality type issues like this is that the level of training is not at a great level. The training is not kept up, and therefore trying to rely on that defense is not an easy one. Although the issue of online harassment hasn't directly been addressed specifically by the bill that's proposed, there is the potential that the employer could be rendered liable where they fail to take the reasonable steps to prevent this. So if there's no policies and procedures in place that look at dealing with the elements of online, how you're monitoring what people do online and people taking sufficient, adequate protections to ensure that they're not harassed, there's going to be an issue of whether, for example, let's use LinkedIn as a medium, whether that's done in the course of their employment or not, because people will use LinkedIn at an instruction of an employer, but people also use it to promote their public profile as well, which is good for them. There's going to have to be a level of understanding as to whether or not that's been something that's been done in the course of employment. And it's going to be a question of fact that each tribunal will have to decide based on the case that is presented before it. So I think that the message I can leave you with is, if you don't, if use of social media is something that is prevalent in your business on a day-to-day basis, now is the time to start looking at, well, what do I have in place to ensure that people are not harassed online, that could be caught by this piece of legislation, and what steps do I need to take to ensure that my employees are protected?
It's a fine line, isn't it, Simon? Because I think we know that, for example, when people post personal stuff, as it were, on social media, on LinkedIn, for example, the reaction is much higher than when they typically post anything to do with business. And I think companies now, as part of their social media marketing, are sort of, if you like, encouraging staff from time to time, putting fairly, I mean, nothing particularly too private, but they're asking people, as it were, to talk about their lives a little bit online. And I think that kind of
shows the human element, doesn't it?
It does. And we know, engagement. I mean, we were with Microsoft recently, it was saying that, no question, when you post something sort of the personal nature, you get a much bigger reaction from your audience, which is great. But then I think, to your point, it kind of, it's on the edge, isn't it? It exposes our staff to potential harassment when they start to do things. So I think there's a position that employers have to take around this. Which is a difficult line,
For the purposes of the Equality Act, anything that's done by an employee in the course of their employment is treated as also having been done by the employer. So an employer can be deemed liable for harassment, whether they had knowledge or to prove the employee's conduct. So if you tell somebody, go and do this, this is how you get an engagement out there with the audience using social media, please go and do it. That's part of your job, and I'm encouraging you to do that because that's how you build your presence online. The employer can be liable for it.
What it says then is that the training and development of the staff to use social media, having discrimination policies in place, is really important. But then updating them, keeping them updating, and having that continual training. And I think that's where recruitment agencies sort of fail, is that continual training.
It's not, and it's lots of employers. Lots of employers just fail with this education piece and the continuous training that they are required to give, and making it valid training as well.
So let's look at a little bit of a change on things that's going on. So flexible working is now an everyday thing. And I'm hearing lots of things about what's happening with flexible working. Can new employees request flexible working from day one? And what should we be sort of doing if companies are putting flexible working in that should change their employees' contract?
I thought when we got to COVID and people were going to start working remotely and hybrid working, I thought flexible working would all calm down a little bit, but I've started to see some problems with it now, because I've had a few instances recently where people have approached me and said, so-and-so doesn't want to come into work anymore. He's quite happy working at home, and I've got a bit of a problem with it. So I'm starting to see it rear its head a little bit again. So maybe it isn't going away, and maybe that's why the government have been talking about it again. So currently, there is a requirement that employees have 26 weeks service before they're entitled to request flexible working. So you need service. And it's only right that's applicable to employees, not to workers. So once they've got 26 weeks service, they can make one flexible working request in any 12-month period. Okay, that's great. That's how it's been for some time. The Employment Relations Flexible Working Bill is in the third reading stage in the House of Lords, and is going to introduce changes if it's enacted. And what it will do is amend the law so it becomes a day one right for employees. So 26 weeks out the window. And also you'll be able to make 2 requests per year. So up from the 1. They'll also require employers to respond to requests made by employees within 2 months, so quickening up the process. And also to consult with employees in order to try and explore all available options before rejecting a request. But the 8 grounds that still currently exists will remain on the same terms. They're not going to change, but it does place an increased onus on employers to be more proactive when responding and accommodating to requests that are made by employers. So that's how the legislation may scope out. In terms of how does a business make sure that they protect themselves when introducing flexible working, well, it comes back to the very basics of employment law, in my view. If you're going to amend terms and conditions of employment, the contracts need to be kept up to date. The policies need to be kept up to date. If you're going to change how somebody does their job and allow them to be hybrid completely, there's still going to be a requirement that, or a need, perhaps, that they come into the business, and that is at their own cost as well, I should hasten to add. That's coming to work, isn't it, on a reasonable request. Now, of course, reasonable is a degree of interpretation. You're not going to expect somebody who is completely hybrid and who you've offered the role to on a hybrid business to start coming into work 3 or 4 days per week on a regular basis. But as time evolves, there's obviously going to be a need for somebody perhaps to come in to participate in a group meeting or to discuss a strategy in relation to a particular client. And in my view, if that's clearly documented and people understand the nature of the relationship, there's going to be no wriggle room for an employee who turns around and says, no, I'm not coming ever again into work. I'm hybrid and remote. In my language, that would be a complete failure to obey a reasonable instruction, of which you may be able to consider, having followed the correct process, terminating that person's employment.
And I think
you think about the basics of employment contracts, following and doing what your employer says to a reasonable extent is absolutely key. You don't just perform your job how you think you would like to do it. There is a master and servant relationship when it comes to an employment relationship, and doing what your master says under the old way it used to work is still core to how some of the employment laws work. Sorry, Heather.
All I was going to say really is to agree with you, Simon. The issue, I think, is that too often in organisations, these situations evolve and drift. And so the documentation isn't up to date. There isn't a policy. It's not written down. So they haven't discussed, how long this agreement lasts for, who gets to decide if it changes. That the very fact that I do still have the right to ask you to come into work when I want to, and we don't have those conversations up front often enough. But I think just formalizing it in a more, rather than letting it drift, will prevent so many of these issues from coming, because the expectations are there in the first place.
I think the question there is that, sorry, go on. I think the comment there, Heather, is the expectations in the first place. And I think it's setting out those expectations and setting out the terms and conditions, because what generally happens is you send your terms and conditions to your employee, they sign it and say, yeah, we're all happy, and off they go. But have they actually read the terms and conditions and understand what contract? So it's what I was saying is that we should be saying to the employee as they come in, we should be outlining the terms and conditions and what that actually means. And that's what Simon's saying there about that, master servant sort of agreement, that should be outlined right from the get-go, that I can request you coming to work, as long as I'm giving you ample notice, etc., and it's not democratic to you, then I think we should be sort of able to do that. But it's that understanding that, does the employee understand that, and does the employer understand how that goes? And I think there's a very big mismatch between what the employee thinks their rights are and what the employer thinks their rights are. And obviously they're both protected by that contract, and therefore both understanding that contract is massively important.
And most of the time there will be sensible discussions that are had between an employer and an employee about, because you do find situations where an employee may work at an opposite end of the country, and traveling and commuting there and back in a day isn't going to work. But these things should be discussed as part of any employment contract right at the very beginning. It is a sort of new phenomenon that people do not work close to perhaps where the office is. It's only in the last 10 years or so that we've talked about this sort of thing like hybrid working, but it does need to be clearly set out, or else there's going to be a disagreement pretty quickly when somebody says something that the other person doesn't agree with.
Yeah, and I think it's also about getting some level of uniformity in to the situation, because at the end of the day, this is, as you just said, Simon, a fairly new phenomenon. There seems to be in most businesses a lack of rigidity around this new concept. And yet, as we were talking about a few weeks ago, when it comes to work from home or flexibility, whichever way we want to term it, employees now see this not as a perk but as a given. So this is a daily, a weekly conversation we have with our clients, and I'm sure is repeated right around the country. And by the way, not just about people living in different elements, different parts of the UK, some distance. I mean, I have clients, of course, that have staff that work abroad on their behalf, working in other countries outside of the UK, in the European Union, and indeed elsewhere in, say, the States. So I think it's a big subject, and it's simply not going to be considered a fad. This is here to stay. And if anything, will just increase in terms of the conversations and the amount of people that would prefer to have some time either partially or fully working from home.
I think we could do a whole webinar on.
We could.
I was going to say, let's ask one simple question on this to sort of there, because some clients will be introducing flexible working. So how should they do that legally to make their contract, compliant? And then there's the other way. Some clients may have already introduced it and now want to change it back again.
Okay, so let me try and just answer some of those questions with some practical advice and a couple of pieces of law. The law in relation to there is a law in relation to minimum amounts of information that people have to be given as part of their employment. It's under Section 1 of the Employment Rights Act. Two of those things are hours of work and the place of work. So it's important to keep those things up to date and change them. In terms of introducing hybrid working or going backwards from it, policies and people understanding how it works is key. If people want to if somebody has been employed on a hybrid type role, but they want to introduce it to being fully in the office or less hybrid or a bit more of a presence, if that is a contract, was part of the contract that was made at the beginning and the outset of the employment, that is going to be a variation to the contract. You can't just vary the contract unilaterally. There's going to have to be an agreement or a discussion about that in the same way that you would vary any terms, but it does have to be approached in the correct manner. There may be good business reasons why you would decide to perhaps stop the hybrid working and offer employment and say, well, the only way I can offer you employment now is by means of you coming to the office on more days per week. But that would still be a termination of the contract as a matter of law. So you do have to think about it carefully. It's not just something that you can just impose. People have based their lives around this hybrid element of working and accepted the job on that basis.
Yes, true.
Amy, I hope that sort of covers your question, because you put, will companies be able to say this role is 100% office based, or will they be able to change the flexible working, meaning that the candidate can apply to an office based role and then request hybrid working? I think the answer is yes, you can request it twice a year.
I think that's a slightly different question, Howard, that Amy's saying. So yes, you can advertise that a role is 100% office based, but if the new law comes in that says you can request flexible working from day one, yes, as soon as they come, they can request a change to it, but that doesn't mean you have to automatically say yes.
Yeah, I think
So
that's
there
exactly
are
right,
8
Heather.
grounds on which you can say no to it, but you would have to consider the request in a timely fashion from the beginning.
You just got to get it straight right at the beginning, get your thoughts straight, and get your contractual documentation straight. Just taking something off the peg is not necessarily going to work for a hybrid job.
Also, it's about being consistent, because if you have a number of employees, you want to be in a position where you have, as you just said, Simon, set rules and guidance on this. Because if you say yes to one person and someone else asks the same question, you say no, you've got a problem.
So I think this is where we're going to start finding things unravel a little bit, because people have been allowed to do hybrid working, or some people have been allowed to do hybrid working. Are we going to find ourselves in a couple of years down the line where people have said, well, I can't offer any more people hybrid working, I've got too many people working hybrid in a hybrid way? And you find yourself in a situation whereby somebody says, well, I've not been offered hybrid working, and I'm going to say that is a discriminatory factor. That's where you need to be super careful.
Yeah.
That's why your policy is got to be nailed on.
Yeah, documentation, open discussion, transparency.
And I would argue revisited regularly, because we're in a very flexible state with all of these. I mean, to use that, sorry, unavoidable pun. It's very fluid at the moment. Things are changing very rapidly. And I think, as you would always say, Simon, with any contract of employment, review it on a regular basis. Legislation's changing, but the world we're living in is changing at such a rapid rate. So, I think, unfortunately, and this is not a criticism really, but most employers put together their contract of employment and then don't review them for years and years and years and years. And in the meantime, the world has changed and legislation has moved on, and they find themselves with contracts of employment that in some instances are not binding and leave them exposed. So I think that's a very important point.
Let's move on to a bigger question that I think all agency owners have looked at to some degree over the case or their career of their contracts, etc. The government have announced that its intention is to address the law in relation to the non-compete clauses. So what effect will that have on employers and employees?
This is a good one and has been talked about for some time. They talked about consulting about changing the law a number of years ago. And I remember reading the consultation paper and looking about what happens in Europe. I know that, for example, in Europe, the way that non-competes work and the way that, restrictive covenant works is often very different to how it operates here. For example, I think in either France or Germany, you've got to pay for restrictive covenants. I can't remember which one it is. But if you look at what's happening now, what the government is doing, in May this year, they announced its proposal to introduce new legislation, which will place a limit on the duration of non-competition provisions. So that would be an absolute barring out provision, stopping you working for a competing recruitment business. So they're talking about limiting it to 3 months. And what the government had said back in 2020, when they launched a consultation paper, it made the following proposals. One, to make non-compete clauses only enforceable where the employers provide compensation for the duration of the clause, with a view to introducing additional transparency measures and statutory limits, and also to make post-termination non-compete clauses entirely unenforceable. So that's what they talked about back in 2020. They've moved away from those proposals now because they're still going to allow employers to restrict activities during periods of garden leave or notice periods which are paid, and the 3-month limit will only apply to post-termination. So we're going to see possibly a whole new way that people need to think about contracts in terms of payment in lieu of notice periods, garden leave, how that's exercised, and in correlation to this 3-month period in relation to complete non-compete provisions. The new legislation will have absolutely no impact on the traditional non-solicitation, so the stealing of clients that I'm afraid I do see within the recruitment sector quite a bit, or in relation to confidentiality provisions. The timeline for these provisions still is unclear. I can't give you a time frame as to when any of this is going to come into effect, but it does seem as though it's going to materialize. In terms of what I would give advice in terms of how people should address all of this, until the statutory cap comes into force, the existing provisions on non-compete, which I should still say, by the way, you need to think very carefully before introducing a non-compete provision into your restrictive covenants. Don't just, I always, when I talk to recruitment, I know I'm slightly veering off here. When I talk to recruiters, I will ask them to go through with me in some detail why they're asking for a non-compete. Because having a non-competing provision in there, badly drafted, can actually invalidate the entire set of restrictive covenants. So I just thought I'd throw that nugget of advice out there as to how I would approach it if I was looking at it with you. So where the restrictive covenants, in terms of how they're currently drafted, do exceed 3 months, they may still be enforceable, provided they meet the requirements of going further than is not that they protect a legitimate business interest and don't go too far. There's no details on how the government's going to introduce this legislation and how that would apply to those where you have a covenant that's longer than 3 months. We don't know if they would be declared void if they exceeded the cap. So just have a think about that if you're looking to try and redraft your covenants. If the non-competes were declared void upon the introduction of the legislation, employers will then need to look at redrafting any that exceed the statutory cap, or you might lose the protection of the non-compete altogether. You should also look at, and I think you should do this as a matter of course, if you have never looked at your non-competes, or you've just stolen them from somebody else, because I'm afraid I do see this as well. Sorry, I say it how it is, Howard.
Surprise, surprise.
Then get them looked at. It's not an expensive job, I can tell you, to have non-compete looked at and to get some advice, and they can absolutely be worth your weight in gold. I can't tell you how many jobs that I have done year to year where the job is about restrictive covenants. I usually have one come across my door every single week, whether it be from an employer wanting to enforce or an employee looking to say, what do I do here? How do I go and earn a living, either setting up on my own, for example, or going to work for somebody else? So they're really important things to think about.
So what can an agency owner do now about that non-compete with existing and new employees coming in? Obviously, because you've got their existing that will be under their old contract. You've got potentially new employees coming under a new contract.
I think I think the best that they can do at the minute is have them looked at and consider whether they exceed the duration of the 3 months that could be caught by the statutory cap. I know we've got no deadline, but we might need to have 2 different types of employment contract. If you're bringing in somebody new and you do want to have a non-compete, you may say, I'm not going to have an employment contract with any non-compete that is longer than 3 months, but I need to strengthen what I've already got to make sure I'm protected in relation to perhaps non-solicitation, non-dealing clauses and things like that. Of course, the easiest way to stop somebody from stealing business is to block them out. But that's not always appropriate in terms of how the law operates in any event. So I would say that the best prevention at the moment is to get them looked at. Think about what could happen if these new laws are going to come into effect. I think we're going to get a bit of notice about them. They're not around the corner. They're not 3 or 6 months away. I think once we know a bit more, you will be given 6 months notice. At that point, you're going to need to get them looked at. But I would encourage somebody to get restrictive covenants looked at regularly. Have many recruitment clients who come back to me on a regular basis saying, I've got this employee coming in. I want to make sure that the restrictions are tailored to the type of work that this person is doing. There is not one size fits all for every single grade of employee.
Yeah, and that's my experience, Simon, is I find that people don't understand the difference between restrictions and non-compete, and they've got something that they pinch from somewhere else that's a cut and paste job, and they think, well, that's okay, that will cover me, without really thinking about, how does this apply to my business? How do I justify that I'm actually protecting a legitimate business interest? And don't realize how complicated it can be to enforce.
So complicated. So complicated. You know, I see lots of covenants that talk about, and I know we're slightly veering off the specifics of how the law is going to change, but in terms of restrictive covenants, you've got clients, prospective clients, candidates, prospective candidates. You've got to be so careful as to how they are defined within the contract to make sure that they've got the best chance of biting, and you're not trying to cast your net so wide as to, for example, bar somebody out of a particular locality where they've never had any dealing with a candidate. And you just say you can't contact anybody in London in relation to working in healthcare jobs. But it might be you've never spoken to anybody within the list of those people.
And I think Annette makes a really good point. So her question is it appropriate to have tighter restrictions for more senior members of staff or longer serving employees?
Absolutely. 100%.
Yeah, these should be role specific.
And that means when you change role that you should get a new employment contract.
Absolutely.
You should get something that is probably not done.
And honestly, I've seen that so many times, Howard, where somebody started as a resourcer and they've been promoted and they might be now an associate director, but they still got the restrictions they had as a resourcer is the only thing they've got in their contract. Like, I've seen that so many times.
Me too. I've seen that many times. Absolutely.
So one last question, Simon, as we sort of we're hitting time, so I'm going to try sneak this in because we're pushing on time. Okay. Last time you were on, we discussed the Harper Trust case about calculating holiday pay. Has there been a further development on that? Because a lot of clients are still asking me what's happening with the holiday pay situation.
I'll try and get my Harper Trust summary into 30
Come
seconds.
on, elevator pitch, Harper Trust.
Go for it, Simon.
My Harper Trust pitch into 30 seconds because it can be quite long-winded. So you think about somebody, these rules have no application to part-time workers. Just to explain that, part-time employees, sorry. It only applies to people who work part year and irregular hours workers. So somebody I would put into the regular hours category would definitely be somebody like an agency worker or somebody who only works parts of the year. Mrs. Brazel was a music teacher who worked term time only. So you can just think about that. She only worked during the term time as a music teacher in a school. So part year and irregular hours workers following Harper Trust are entitled to 5 weeks paid leave every single year. Holiday pay should be calculated according to the calendar week method, which is an average of 52 weeks. You can go back over 104 weeks if there's weeks where they haven't worked. You've got to understand the separation between leave and pay. They are different concepts. If you use and still use the percentage method of 12.07% to calculate holiday pay, that is no longer safe. If I had a highlighter to underline what I was saying, I would underline those words. The method of using rolled up holiday pay is still unlawful, but seems to be something that, provided it is done in a specific way, can work. And that would be to make sure it's not just blended in to one particular rate where the individual has absolutely no idea what they've been paid. In terms of what the development is, the development in the law is there was a consultation. It's now closed. It closed in March, seeking the views on holiday pay entitlement for part year and irregular hours workers going forward. The government has said that they're looking at the following proposals: making pro rata entitlements a lawful approach, introducing a 52-week reference period, weeks in which no work is performed to be included in the reference period, a monthly reference period to be used where employees have less than 1 year's service. Then we had a policy paper that the government brought out in May entitled Smarter Regulation to Grow the Economy. And they've given some more details of things that they're looking at in relation to holiday pay. They've talked about merging the two existing holiday entitlements that we've got. We've got the national law, which gives the extra 1.6 weeks on top of the EU law. So they're going to make it a one size fits all 5.6 weeks, because that does become relevant in terms of how you calculate certain things, for example, in relation to sickness and things like that. And what the government has also said is that they're going to look at making lawful the use of rolled up holiday pay, which is currently deemed unlawful and it's proposed that under that rule, that holiday pay will be paid at the 12.07% of all hours worked. So what you can see that the government are doing is they're trying to reduce the administrative burdens that have come about in relation to the calculation of holiday pay. Because I can tell you now, that Harper Trust case took a very, very long time and a lot of effort to get to court, and has produced some results that people cannot work with. There is no magic answer to the Harper Trust case. I can't sit here and say to you, this is what you do. All I can say to you is 12.07% does not work as a calculation entitlement. But they're also trying to balance the need to ensure that workers do receive an entitlement that's proportionate to the amount of time that they actually work. So you can see through Harper.
The proposal is to try to make the 12.07% work again, isn't it?
It is.
The proposal.
100%.
To kind of make
because
it
one
work
of the
the way it's always
examples
worked.
that was quoted during the Harper Trust case, and I'll just leave you with this particular nugget. I think one of the barristers quoted an example of an exam invigilator who works 1 week of the year and earns £1,000. If he was employed on that contract overarching for the entire year from 1 year to the next, he'd be entitled to 5.6 weeks holiday and £5,600 worth of holiday entitlement. So he'd earn more holiday than he was actually paid in wages. Whereas under the previous rules, he would only have got £120.70. Now, I know I'm giving you an anomaly case, but it just shows you how the law interpreted as a result of the Supreme Court decision has unfolded.
It's such an interesting law, and that's I left that one sort of to the end because I thought, it's still sort of bouncing around and it's still waiting for it to be clear. But what we're saying really from today's situation is that we need to be having more due diligence in our umbrella companies. We need to absolutely ensure that we are training our staff on discrimination policies, especially when posting online and things like that. We need to make sure that our flexible working is within our contract, is updated on a regular basis, and we need to make sure that our non-compete clause are absolutely solid and watertight, irrespective of the change of law of what's going on, and people need to understand how they work. Simon, it's always fascinating having you on. I'd love to bring you back, and have a conversation sort of on other things sort of later on in the year as things start to move. And
you can't escape, Simon.
You can't escape. No, absolutely not. Ladies and gents, thanks very much for your time. It's been, a very, very interesting session. Very scary in some areas, but very enlightening in others that we can sort of deal with it. But I hope it gives you a way to move forward. Next week we start a complete new set of webinars. We're yet to write them, so I can't tell you what they are. But we'll think of something. I'm sure we'll think of something. But there you go. But thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, Simon. Thank you very much. Much appreciated. Heather and Paul. See you soon.
Thank you again, Simon.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Take care.
Cheers.
Bye, everybody.